You may have heard that on the 1st of October, Microsoft introduced changes into Microsoft licensing. I am not exaggerating saying that they changed the entire hosting landscape, bring your own license landscape, completely.
The honour of closing us off on the ITAM stream is Alexandra, or how do you want to be referred to on this one? Because I know you have another name that people know you by.
Yeah, my short name is Sasha.
From Sam Expert, many of you will have seen him on LinkedIn, YouTube. We're going to be talking about Microsoft licensing changes.
Firstly, let's talk about what's changed, and then let's talk about why it's important and where you may look for maybe new opportunities, maybe reshape the way you do your cloud. Do we have any providers here at all? Any SaaS companies? I know Flexera does some SaaS. So you are mostly either end users or consultants, correct? Because I need to shape my presentation in the right way. The first change, any subscription license may be taken and brought to any services provider. With a little nuance, I'll tell about it. So what Microsoft did is, if you have any subscription license, either with software assurance, subscription with software assurance, CSP subscription, it now can be taken without checks and long due diligence to any provider. Windows Server, as a consequence, now has bring your own license rights, which it didn't have. Again, that's a big change. Windows Server can be now licensed per virtual machine, and because we are here mostly about the end users, on premises and in the cloud, when you bring your own license to the cloud. Providers didn't get this right. They can host your Windows Server workloads licensed like this, but they cannot sell SPLA virtual machines through this licensing program. So this is purely end-user-centric change. And Windows 11, two things happened. If you had users with Chromebooks, even with Windows E3, E5 subscription licenses, they still couldn't access VDAs unless they had a VDA add-on. Now, you don't need it. They simplified it. The other thing, which is related to CSP licenses, previously you couldn't virtualize them on premises, only on a third-party platform. Now you can, which was a big shortcoming of the CSP licenses. What I call this provider class system has been also seriously simplified. Before we had all this complexity, and you needed to know if you're taking your licenses to a service provider, you needed to know their authorization levels, whether you can do that. That was actually on you. Now it's looking like this. It now doesn't matter whether they have SPLA or they don't. I can imagine now a services provider without any SPLA licensing agreement, and I'll explain why. The only important division that remains is this: listed providers and authorized outsourcers. This is the key division between the providers. Do you know why they're called listed? There's actually just a list. That's a list. It's a document. It only has 5 lines in it, which says these are the listed providers, and then 4 bullet points with these 4 names. And then we have authorized outsourcers. Right now, it's one of the most frequently asked questions: who are the authorized outsourcers? Not them. This is a very confusing word, authorized, because there are actually no authorizations required. The only authorization that is required is don't be them. Simple as that. Why that difference is important is that all these new changes only apply to authorized outsourcers. Listed providers remain as they were since October 2019. For the geeks, we have licensing geeks here. Azure has license mobility plus Azure Hybrid Benefit plus Windows 11 Azure offerings, products, which the rest of the listed providers don't have. So all these changes apply only to bring your own license to any hosting provider, except for those big 4. Plus, as I said, a few changes apply to on-premises use. Please stop thinking about providers now from the 1st of October as only services providers with hosting. Your incumbent outsourcers with their own data center are effectively now authorized outsourcers. Shared platforms are also included, which is important. Dedicated hardware, nothing changed. But if there's a cloud infrastructure with lots of VMs from various end clients, then again, now there's no difference whether that's shared or dedicated. For providers now, there's no requirement for these 2 authorizations, license mobility part and KMTH. Why it's important for the end client? Stop caring about it. You don't need to check it. Now everybody is authorized. They don't even need SPLA. What I call a subscription license is, again, if you're paying any sort of recurring fee to Microsoft, that license may be taken to a provider. When you stop paying for it, for example, you cancel software assurance on a perpetual license, you lose that. So you must continue paying to Microsoft to get those rights. Thing that is not on these slides, but you must know it, is when we talk about server licenses, when you bring your server licenses like this, or even when you want to license Windows Server on premises using the per VM new licensing model, all client access licenses must also have some sort of a subscription on them. CSP hoster, as end client, don't even look at that. They may host licenses, even CSP licenses on subscription, even if they're not CSP hosted. If somebody comes to you and says, we are a CSP hosted, therefore we have an advantage, the only advantage they have is those who have this authorization may pre-build virtual machines for you using their media and their keys. But the licenses are still yours. That's the only difference. It's the early access, proactive access to media and keys. It's not a required authorization to host your licenses. The entire landscape of Microsoft licensing and hosting as well, and cloud. It's such an interconnected world. Where may this affect you? In October 2025, services providers, and especially that affects software as a services providers. So if you are, as an example, consuming a hosted SAP service right now, or an Oracle service, some sort of an ERP that is hosted, that you buy as a service from a provider, and they host those workloads in AWS or Azure or Google or Alibaba maybe, that may somehow affect you indirectly. The problem is there are no details yet right now. The good things, just to summarize, better choice of outsources. Windows Server bring your own license. It's a good change because previously you could only take it to Azure, Azure. Now you can take it to any provider, shared or dedicated. And then how do you do that? With the new per virtual machine licensing, which works very similar to SQL Server. If you know how SQL Server per VM licensing works, it works very much like that. CSP subscriptions have improved. So if you've been hesitating about whether you want to switch from a different licensing program to CSP, because there are limitations. So there are fewer limitations now on the CSP licenses.
So Sasha, are they retrospective, those improvements?
Yeah, remember the first presentation today that Dai gave, and he said that you're bound by the terms of the contract when you signed it. Microsoft has a stipulation around it. And what they say is you don't have to accept the new product terms unless you want to. So they don't fix you on the product terms that was effective on the effective date of the agreement. The bad things, and it is a bad thing. So 90% of the end clients, at least those that we work with, they don't use smaller providers. They are either on AWS or Azure. And therefore, if you are one of those, nothing related to hosting applies to you, unfortunately. Maybe it will kind of open the minds of decision makers to the vast number of, I would say, middle tier, still large services providers. There's more to the cloud world than just AWS and Azure and Google. If you are one of those clients that is consuming a third-party SaaS, and if it's hosted in a complicated way on one of the listed providers, it may affect your relationship with that provider. I hope it won't. Just to give you a very simple explanation of what I'm talking about. So right now, they may charge you for licenses through their hosting agreement, the SPLA agreement. They won't be able to do it in 2025. So whether there's going to be still a charge from AWS to them, then redirected to you somehow, recovered costs from you, we don't know. Because the worst case scenario is you will have to also pay a separate bill from AWS. Whilst right now, for you, it's completely opaque. You just pay into that provider. I was hoping that at least somebody here would be in the provider world.
Sorry, what does QMTH stand for?
Qualified Multi-Tenant Hoster, another name that makes absolutely no sense unless you know what's behind it. So you had to become qualified, you had to become Tier 1 CSP, go through other qualifications, have your own data centers, and then you would get a right to host Windows 11 and Microsoft 365 apps.
I see.
What Microsoft is basically doing is it's opening up the competitive landscape to try and broaden out the number of service providers.
I think so, yes. They were pushed into that to an extent by several movements in the European Union. Groups of services providers were lobbying the EU bureaucratic structures to push on Microsoft to level the playing field between themselves and Azure. They don't really care about AWS and Google, to be honest. Why would I if I was a small provider? But Azure, why are clients allowed to take the license to Azure, but not my data center? That's an unfair advantage. And it's not like Microsoft didn't keep any advantages. There are still a few. For example, only in Azure, you can license a Windows Server data center machine with Windows Server standard licenses. You can't do it on providers. Only on Azure, you're not required to bring your CALs, whilst you have to have CALs with a say to take a license to a service provider. So there are still advantages of Azure. It's still cheaper sometimes to run workloads in Azure, all things considered. I'd like to highlight at this point particular. Bring your own license compliance is on end clients. There are very few clarifications about how this is all going to work, although it's already in effect. All these changes are in effect. But the nitty-gritty of how Microsoft will interpret non-compliance, that is still not available, not codified. Before the 1st of October, if you had to take your license to a services provider, that still, by the way, works with listed providers, you had to fill in specific license verification forms. You couldn't just bring your license like that. You had to go through a process because, by default, the compliance responsibility is on the provider, not on you, even when you don't ask them and deploy something in the virtual machine that you rent from them. How this is going to work with suddenly much wider range of services providers and Microsoft allowing you to take your licenses and bring them to their data centers in terms of compliance is not clear. Be careful that when you take your license to a services provider, you're still responsible for the compliance of those virtual machines and instances of Office and VDIs and whatnot.
I'm just thinking that if you were Microsoft and you wanted to corral in a bunch of customers you wanted to audit, you could go to one authorized user and order 20 of them in a heartbeat.
Strictly speaking, in the documentation they get from the auditors, they don't get the client names. The auditor knows the names because it's part of the process. They review the contracts, but the report they submit to Microsoft has obfuscated names. Client 1, Client 2, Client 3, and so on. Microsoft's ultimate goal is not to punish the provider. They just want their money. Future annuity, securing the revenue. That's what they want. I ask myself, can we summarize this? Is it positive or negative or mixed for specific categories of consumers of Microsoft software? And if you look at the end clients, it's mostly positive. The only really two negative categories who are not in this room are the listed providers or providers of software as a service applications that host their workloads on listed providers. Otherwise, I think Microsoft did a really good giveaway.
Do you get extended support if you migrate a legacy Windows Server into Azure?
Yes.
As far as I know, yes, but you don't get it on any other provider, obviously. That's another competitive advantage of whether that's fair or not, of Azure. What I want to leave in your minds is that if you've been thinking about moving some of the workloads to your providers or your outsourcers, you can start thinking about that. It's now much easier. Small outsourcers, they can start tomorrow deploying their own racks and hosting multiple client virtual machines in them. I had a business previously, my previous company that I started in about 2003 and closed in 2013. It was half software asset management and half system integration. And I wish I had that ability at the time. Sometimes we would service the entire building with 5 or 6 companies. I would have killed for an ability to put my racks there and sell them everything as a service. Now I can, but I'm not doing that anymore. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much once again. So we've got refreshment break.